Margaret Chun sat by her kitchen window, watching the morning light dance across her small herb garden. The invitation lay open on the wooden table beside her coffee cup, cream-colored paper with elegant script announcing her granddaughter Emma's wedding. After 3 years of barely hearing from her family, this simple card felt like a bridge thrown across an impossible distance. She traced Emma's handwriting with her finger. Even now, at 25, Emma still wrote with the careful loops Margaret had taught her during those summer afternoons when she was 8. Back then, they would sit together on this same porch, Emma practicing her letters while Margaret shared stories about building her company from nothing. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else now. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. Margaret picked up her phone when it rang, recognizing her son David's number immediately. His voice came through hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mom, I wanted to make sure you got Emma's invitation." "I did. It's beautiful." She kept her voice steady, though something in his tone already made her wary. "Great. So, the ceremony is at 2, reception right after. It's going to be pretty formal." David paused and Margaret could hear whispering in the background. "Listen, Mom, Linda wanted me to mention maybe keep things low-key. You know how weddings can be. Everyone wants the focus on Emma." Margaret understood perfectly. Linda, her daughter-in-law, had made her feelings clear over the years through 1,000 small cuts. The Thanksgiving invitations that came too late to plan for. The family photos where Margaret was somehow always cropped out. The way Linda would change the subject whenever Margaret's business background came up in conversation. "Of course," Margaret said. "I wouldn't dream of taking attention away from Emma." After David hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet of her small house. She had built Chen Industries from a single office and a borrowed computer, turning it into one of the region's most successful consulting firms. She had employed hundreds of people, advised major corporations, been featured on magazine covers. But to Linda, she was just an old woman who lived alone and grew too many tomatoes. The irony wasn't lost on her. Margaret had stepped back from running the company when David graduated college, hoping to spend more time with family. She had wanted to be the grandmother who attended school plays and taught her grandchildren to bake. Instead, she had become invisible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Remember, simple and understated tomorrow. We want Emma to shine." Margaret set the phone aside without responding. She walked to her bedroom and opened the closet, looking through her clothes. Most of her business suits still hung there, perfectly pressed but unworn for years. Behind them, she found a navy blue dress she had bought for a company dinner long ago. Simple, elegant, nothing flashy. As she held the dress up to herself in the mirror, Margaret caught sight of the photograph on her dresser. It showed her accepting an award from the Chamber of Commerce 5 years ago, back when Chen Industries was at its peak. She remembered that night, the respect in people's voices, the way they listened when she spoke. Now, her own family acted like she had never accomplished anything at all. Margaret had always believed that love meant putting others first. When David was young and struggling with confidence, she had stepped back from the spotlight to build him up. When he married Linda, she had tried to give them space. When Emma was born, she had offered help without being pushy. Every choice had been made with love, but somehow she had managed to love herself right out of their lives. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly. Margaret dressed carefully in her navy blue outfit, adding a simple pearl necklace that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror and saw a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. When had she become so small? The venue was a restored mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by manicured gardens and old oak trees. Margaret arrived early, hoping to find Emma for a private moment before the ceremony. Instead, she found herself standing alone in the foyer while wedding guests streamed past her in designer dresses and expensive suits. No one greeted her. No one seemed to recognize her at all. Margaret made her way to the ceremony space, a sun-drenched courtyard with white chairs arranged in perfect rows. She chose a seat near the back off to one side. From there, she could see everything without being seen. Linda swept past in a burgundy gown that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in 6 months. She was surrounded by relatives and friends, all of them hanging on her words about the venue, the flowers, the perfect weather that had finally emerged. Linda caught sight of Margaret and gave a brief nod, polite but distant, the kind you might give a service worker. David appeared at Linda's side. Handsome in his tailored suit but wearing that uncomfortable expression Margaret knew too well. He had perfected that look years ago, the face of a man caught between two women he couldn't please simultaneously. The catering is from that new place downtown, Linda was telling someone nearby. David and I chose everything ourselves. We wanted Emma's day to be perfect. Margaret listened to Linda hold court, describing every detail of the wedding planning as if she were the star of the show rather than the mother of the groom. Not once did Linda mention that Margaret had offered to help with expenses. Not once did she acknowledge that half the guests were people Margaret had known for decades. Emma appeared in her wedding dress, radiant and nervous. She caught Margaret's eye from across the courtyard and smiled. Not the polite smile she gave other guests, but the real one Margaret remembered from childhood. Emma started to move toward her, but Linda intercepted her, steering her toward the photographer. "We need to get the family photos done," Linda announced loudly. "Just immediate family for now." Margaret watched from her seat as they arranged themselves for pictures. David, Linda, Emma, and Emma's fiancé Marcus. The photographer took dozens of shots while Margaret sat 30 feet away, close enough to hear their laughter but far enough away that she might as well have been invisible. An elderly woman settled into the chair beside Margaret. "Excuse me, aren't you Margaret Chen?" Margaret turned, surprised to be recognized. The woman was well dressed, probably in her 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Helen Rodriguez. My husband used to work with you at the Chamber of Commerce. He always spoke so highly of you." "That's very kind," Margaret said, though she felt awkward accepting praise while sitting alone at her own granddaughter's wedding. Helen glanced around the courtyard, taking in the scene. "Beautiful wedding. Are you enjoying yourself?" The question was innocent enough, but Margaret felt the weight of her isolation in it. She was at her granddaughter's wedding, dressed appropriately, behaving perfectly, and yet she felt like a stranger who had wandered into someone else's celebration. "It's lovely," Margaret said, because what else could she say? The ceremony began, and Margaret watched Emma walk down the aisle on David's arm. Her granddaughter looked beautiful and happy, and for a moment that was enough. This wasn't about Margaret's hurt feelings or Linda's coldness. This was about Emma starting her life with someone she loved. But as the minister spoke about family and the bonds that tie us together, Margaret couldn't help thinking about her own bonds. How had they become so fragile? When had loving her family become a one-way street? After the ceremony, guests moved to the reception area where cocktails were being served on the terrace. Margaret found herself standing alone again, watching clusters of conversation form and dissolve around her. She recognized many faces: business associates, old friends, people who had once sought her advice and respected her opinion. Now they seemed to look right through her. Linda was in her element, moving between groups with practiced ease. Margaret heard her telling someone about David's work, how well he was doing since taking over more responsibilities at the company Margaret had built. The company she had handed over to David piece by piece, hoping to keep it in the family. "David has such vision," Linda was saying. "He's really modernized everything. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions to move forward." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. She had made those tough decisions for 20 years. She had built something from nothing, weathered recessions, created jobs, supported the community. Now she was being erased from the story entirely. Emma appeared at her side, still glowing in her wedding dress. "Grandma, I'm so glad you're here." Margaret hugged her granddaughter carefully, not wanting to wrinkle the beautiful gown. "You look stunning, sweetheart. Are you happy?" "So happy," Emma said, but then her expression grew troubled. "Grandma, I need to tell you something. I asked Mom to seat you at the family table, but she said there wasn't room. I'm sorry. I should have insisted." Margaret felt the words like a physical blow. Even at her own granddaughter's wedding, there wasn't room for her at the family table. "It's fine, darling. I understand." But it wasn't fine, and Margaret was tired of pretending it was. Emma squeezed her hand. "I wish things were different. I wish Mom and Dad understood how important you are." Before Margaret could respond, Linda appeared beside them. "Emma, honey, we need you for more photos. The light is perfect right now." Emma was whisked away, leaving Margaret alone again. She found her assigned table number 12, near the back, filled with distant relatives and family friends she barely knew. As she sat down, Margaret wondered how she had become such a stranger in her own family's life. The sun was setting over the terrace, painting everything in golden light. It was the kind of evening that should have been perfect. Instead, Margaret felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold, while her own had somehow been put on pause years ago. She thought about going home early, slipping away before anyone noticed. But something held her there in that uncomfortable chair, surrounded by the sound of laughter and conversation that never included her. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was the growing certainty that this couldn't be how her story ended. The dinner service began as the last traces of daylight faded into deep purple. Margaret watched the waitstaff move efficiently between tables, serving courses she had helped pay for to guests who acted like she didn't exist. The distant relatives at her table made polite conversation about the weather and the beautiful venue, but no one asked about her life or seemed to know who she was. At the head table, Linda held court like a queen at her own celebration. She had changed into an even more elaborate dress for the reception, deep emerald green with jewelry that caught the light every time she gestured. David sat beside her, nodding along to whatever story she was telling, his face wearing that same strained smile Margaret had seen so many times before. The wedding planning was such an adventure, Linda was saying to the table next to theirs, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. David and I wanted everything to be perfect for Emma. We've been planning this for over a year. Margaret stirred her soup mechanically. She remembered Emma calling her 8 months ago, excited about getting engaged, asking if they could meet for lunch to talk about wedding ideas. That lunch had never happened. Every time Margaret had called to follow up, Linda had answered instead, explaining that Emma was too busy to meet but that everything was under control. A waiter refilled Margaret's wine glass, and she found herself grateful for the simple human interaction, even though he was just doing his job. She took a small sip and let her eyes wander across the reception. The venue was beautiful, no doubt expensive, with string lights overhead and floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Excuse me," said the woman sitting across from her, an elderly cousin whose name Margaret couldn't quite remember. "Aren't you David's mother?" "Yes, I am." "Oh, how wonderful. You must be so proud. Linda was just telling us about how successful the business has become under David's leadership. Chin Industries, right? Such an impressive company." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Yes, it is." The woman beamed. "Linda says David built it up from practically nothing. What vision for someone so young. You must be thrilled to see him doing so well." Margaret set down her wine glass carefully. "I'm very proud of David." She couldn't bring herself to correct the woman's understanding of the company's history. What would be the point? Linda had clearly rewritten the narrative so completely that even distant family members believed David had created the business himself. The 20 years Margaret had spent building Chin Industries had been compressed into a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. From across the terrace, Margaret caught Emma's eye. Her granddaughter was sitting at the head table, radiant in her wedding dress, but there was something in her expression that looked almost guilty. Emma had always been perceptive even as a child. She could probably sense the tension in the air, the way conversations stopped when Margaret approached, the careful distance everyone maintained. The main course arrived, perfectly prepared salmon with seasonal vegetables. Margaret ate slowly, listening to the conversations flowing around her. Business associates who had once called her for advice now spoke about David, as if he were the sole architect of the company's success. Old friends who had attended Margaret's retirement party 3 years ago seemed to have forgotten she had ever been part of the business world at all. Linda's voice rose above the others again. "David has such innovative ideas. Just last month, he restructured the entire consulting division. Sometimes you need fresh blood to really transform a company. You know?" Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She had restructured that same division 5 years earlier, implementing the exact framework David was now using. But of course no one remembered that. History had been quietly rewritten, one conversation at a time. Helen Rodriguez, the woman who had recognized her earlier, appeared at Margaret's side. "Would you mind if I joined you for a moment? My table is a bit loud for my taste." "Of course, please sit." Helen settled into the empty chair beside Margaret, her own plate in hand. Beautiful wedding, but I have to say, I'm surprised to find you sitting back here. Shouldn't the woman who built Chen Industries be at the family table? Margaret glanced around, hoping no one else had heard. It's fine. I prefer quieter spots anyway. Helen studied Margaret's face. You know, my late husband always said you were one of the sharpest business minds he'd ever met. He used to quote your strategies in his own work. Think like Margaret Chen, he'd say when we faced a tough decision. The compliment warmed Margaret more than it should have. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as competent, as someone whose opinions mattered. He was very kind to say that. Kind nothing. It was the truth. Helen looked toward the head table where Linda was gesturing animatedly. Things change, I suppose. New generation takes over, old contributions get forgotten. Margaret followed her gaze. Linda was now standing, apparently preparing to give a speech. A microphone had been brought to the table, and the reception noise was gradually dying down as people noticed. Thank you all for being here tonight, Linda began, her voice confident and clear. Marcus and Emma, you look absolutely radiant. David and I are so thrilled to welcome Marcus into our family. Margaret felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, but she had grown used to it. Linda's speeches never included her. I wanted to take a moment to talk about family, Linda continued, and about building something together. David and I have been so blessed to work side by side, growing our business and creating something we can pass down to future generations. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Our business. As if Linda had been there from the beginning, working 18-hour days and risking everything on ideas that might have failed. As if she had been the one taking out loans against her house to keep the company afloat during the recession. Chen Industries started as a dream, Linda went on, and through hard work and dedication, David has built it into something we can all be proud of. It takes real vision to create lasting success. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. Around her, guests were nodding and smiling, accepting this revised version of history as fact. Even people who should have known better were applauding Linda's narrative. Helen leaned closer to Margaret. This is remarkable, she whispered. I was at your retirement party 3 years ago. I remember the speech you gave about founding the company in 1985. People forget, Margaret said quietly. Or they choose to forget. Emma stood up at the head table, taking the microphone from Linda. Margaret's heart lifted slightly, hoping her granddaughter might set the record straight. Thank you, Linda, Emma said, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. And thank you, Dad, for everything you've taught me about business and life. Watching you build something meaningful has been such an inspiration. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Even Emma, her own granddaughter, was perpetuating the myth that David had built the company alone. Had they all forgotten so completely? Or had Margaret simply been erased so gradually that no one noticed when she disappeared from the story entirely? The speeches continued, but Margaret stopped listening. She found herself thinking about the early days of Chen Industries, when she had worked out of a cramped office above a dry cleaner. She remembered the first big contract she had landed, the night she had stayed up until dawn perfecting a presentation that would make or break the company. She remembered hiring her first employees, including David when he graduated college. David had been proud of her then. He used to bring his friends by the office to show off his successful mother. When had that pride turned to embarrassment? When had her accomplishments become something to minimize rather than celebrate? Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, we'd like to invite the bride and groom to the dance floor for their first dance. Margaret watched Emma and Marcus move together to a slow romantic song. They looked so happy, so full of hope for their future. She remembered dancing at her own wedding 40 years ago, back when anything seemed possible. She had been building her business then too, working days at a corporate job and nights on her own consulting projects. Her husband Robert had been so supportive, so proud of her ambitions. He had died 8 years ago, too soon to see what Chen Industries would become, but also too soon to witness how thoroughly Margaret had been written out of its history. Other couples joined the dance floor, David and Linda moving together with practiced ease, Emma's friends laughing as they danced with their partners. Margaret remained at her table, watching the celebration swirl around her like she was trapped behind glass. Would you care to dance? Margaret looked up surprised. A distinguished older man stood beside her chair, his hand extended. She recognized him vaguely, someone from the business community, though she couldn't place his name. Oh, that's very kind, but I'm fine here. Nonsense. Beautiful night, beautiful music. I'm James Morrison, by the way. We met several years ago at a Chamber of Commerce event. Margaret remembered now. James had owned a successful law firm before retiring. Of course. Nice to see you again. The pleasure is mine. Now about that dance. Margaret glanced around the table. No one was paying attention to her anyway. Well, if you insist. James led her to the edge of the dance floor, where they swayed gently to the music. It felt strange to be noticed, to have someone treat her like she was worth their time. I have to say, James said as they danced, I was surprised to hear that speech earlier, about Chun Industries being David's creation. I could have sworn you founded that company. Margaret's steps faltered slightly. People's memories can be unreliable. Indeed. Though I distinctly remember nominating you for Business Person of the Year about 10 years ago. You won if I recall correctly. The song ended, and James escorted her back to her table with old-fashioned courtesy. Thank you for the dance, Margaret. It was an honor. As James walked away, Margaret felt a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. At least someone remembered who she used to be, even if her own family seemed determined to forget. The evening was winding down now. Some guests were beginning to leave, gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes. Margaret considered leaving too, but something held her in place. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the faint hope that someone in her family might finally acknowledge her presence. Linda was holding court near the gift table, accepting congratulations on the beautiful wedding. Margaret could hear her voice carrying across the terrace. David and I just wanted everything to be perfect for Emma. When you've built something together the way we have, you want to share that success with the people you love. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone terrace. Several people looked over, but she didn't care anymore. She had spent 3 years being polite, being understanding, being invisible. Tonight something felt different. Tonight she was tired of disappearing. Margaret walked toward the edge of the terrace, needing air and space away from Linda's ongoing performance. The night had grown cooler, and most guests were gathered closer to the warmth of the reception area. She found herself standing near the garden entrance, looking out at the darkened paths lined with small lanterns. Behind her, she could hear Linda still talking, her voice animated as she described the wedding planning process to yet another group of admirers. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to center herself, the way she used to before important business presentations. She had survived board meetings with hostile investors and negotiations with difficult clients. She could survive her granddaughter's wedding reception. A commotion near the entrance caught her attention. Guests were turning to look, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Margaret followed their gaze and felt her breath catch. Walking through the garden entrance was someone she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Robert Sterling moved with the same quiet confidence she remembered, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He carried an elegant walking stick not because he needed it, but because it had always been part of his distinguished image. Margaret's heart began beating faster. Robert had been her business partner during the early years of Chun Industries, before he sold his stake and moved to the East Coast. More than that, he had been her friend, her ally, one of the few people who truly understood what she had built and sacrificed. Robert's eyes scanned the reception until they found her. Their gazes met across the crowded terrace, and he smiled the same warm, knowing smile that had gotten her through countless difficult meetings decades ago. He walked directly toward her, ignoring the curious stares of other guests. Margaret felt herself straightening, some long-dormant part of her personality awakening as he approached. "Margaret Chun," he said when he reached her, his voice carrying the same authority it had always held. "You look wonderful." "Robert, what are you doing here?" "Emma invited me. She tracked down my contact information and called personally. Said she wanted all the important people in her life to be present today." He glanced around the reception, taking in the scene. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised to find you standing here alone." Margaret felt a flush of warmth at Emma's gesture, followed immediately by confusion. Her granddaughter had never mentioned inviting Robert, and Linda certainly hadn't included him in any of the planning discussions Margaret had overheard. "I imagine Linda doesn't know you're here," Margaret said. "I imagine you're right." Robert's expression grew more serious. "Emma said some interesting things when she called me, about how certain family members seem to have developed amnesia regarding the history of Chan Industries." Before Margaret could respond, she noticed that Linda had spotted Robert. Her daughter-in-law's face had gone pale, and she was gripping David's arm while whispering something urgent in his ear. David looked confused, then alarmed as he followed Linda's gaze. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, slightly worn with age. "I brought something that belongs to you." Margaret stared at the envelope. "What is it?" "The original partnership agreement for Chan Industries. The one that clearly states you as founder and majority owner. I kept copies of all our early documents." He placed the envelope in her hands. "I thought it might be time for some people to refresh their memories." The envelope felt heavy in Margaret's hands, weighted with more than just paper. She looked toward the head table where Linda was now standing, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. David remained seated, looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Robert, I don't know if this is the right time." "It's exactly the right time." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've kept quiet for 2 years, watching from a distance as they rewrote history. But when Emma called me, when she told me how they've been treating you, Margaret, some things can't be allowed to stand." Other guests had begun to notice the tension. Conversations were becoming more subdued, as people sensed something significant was happening. Margaret could feel eyes on her, but for the first time all evening, the attention didn't feel like judgment. Robert stepped toward the center of the reception area, his voice carrying easily across the terrace. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The remaining conversations died away entirely. Even the waitstaff paused in their duties, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Linda took a step forward as if to interrupt, but something in Robert's expression stopped her. "I realize I'm not scheduled to speak tonight," Robert continued, "but I hope you'll indulge an old man who traveled a long way to be here. I wanted to share something about the remarkable woman who made this celebration possible." Margaret felt her cheeks burning. This wasn't what she had wanted, wasn't how she had imagined the evening unfolding. But there was no stopping Robert now. 40 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I had the privilege of partnering with a young woman who had an extraordinary vision. She wanted to build a consulting firm that would help businesses succeed, while treating employees with dignity and respect." He gestured toward Margaret, and every eye in the reception turned to her. She stood frozen, the envelope still clutched in her hands. That woman was Margaret Chen. She founded Chen Industries in 1985 with nothing but a borrowed computer, a rented office, and more determination than anyone I've ever met. I was lucky enough to be her partner for the first 10 years, before I moved away and sold my stake back to her. Linda's face had gone from pale to gray. She was gripping the back of her chair now, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "Over the next 3 decades, Robert continued, Margaret built that small consulting firm into one of the most respected businesses in the region. She employed hundreds of people, mentored dozens of young professionals, and yes, she raised a son who she hoped would continue her legacy." David was staring at his hands now, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for him, even through her own emotional turmoil. 3 years ago, Margaret made the decision to step back from day-to-day operations and hand control to David. It was an act of love and trust. She wanted to spend more time with family, to enjoy the fruits of her decades of labor. Robert's voice grew harder, more pointed. What she didn't expect was to be erased from the story entirely. To have her contributions minimized, her sacrifices forgotten, her very presence treated as an inconvenience. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of stares. Some guests looked shocked, others uncomfortable. A few were nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Helen Rodriguez began to clap. Slowly, quietly at first, then with growing conviction. James Morrison joined her, then several other older guests who remembered Margaret's business reputation. The applause spread gradually through the reception, Not enthusiastic but respectful, acknowledging. Margaret found her voice at last. Robert, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. He turned back to the crowd. Margaret Chun is a woman of extraordinary grace. She has endured years of being overlooked and undervalued without complaint. But some truths are too important to remain buried. Emma appeared at Margaret's side, her wedding dress rustling as she moved quickly across the terrace. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. Grandma, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were. I didn't realize how badly they were treating you. Margaret pulled her granddaughter into a hug, careful not to wrinkle the beautiful dress. It's not your fault, sweetheart. Yes, it is. I should have spoken up. I should have made sure you were at the family table, should have mentioned you in my speech. I let them make you invisible, and that's not okay. Over Emma's shoulder, Margaret could see Linda standing alone now. David had moved away from her, and the small crowd that usually surrounded her had dispersed. For the first time all evening, Linda looked uncertain, vulnerable. Emma, Margaret said softly, this is your wedding day. Don't let family drama overshadow your happiness. This isn't drama, Grandma. This is about respect. About truth. Emma pulled back, her eyes fierce with determination that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. About time someone acknowledged what you really accomplished. Robert approached them, his expression satisfied but gentle. Margaret, would you like to say something? The microphone was being offered to her. Margaret looked out at the assembled guests, some familiar faces from her business days, some strangers, all waiting to hear what she had to say. For years she had chosen silence, had swallowed her hurt and disappointment for the sake of family peace. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the truth had already been spoken. Margaret took the microphone, her hand steadier than she expected. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying easily across the hushed reception. I didn't come here tonight expecting recognition, she began. I came to celebrate Emma and Marcus, to witness the beginning of their life together. That's still the most important thing happening here. She paused, looking directly at her granddaughter. Emma, you are brilliant and kind and strong. You have your whole life ahead of you, full of possibilities I can't even imagine. That's what we should be celebrating. Emma smiled through her tears, nodding. Margaret's gaze moved to David, who was finally looking at her. David, you are my son and I love you. I'm proud of what you've accomplished with the company. I always hoped you would take it further than I ever could. David's face crumpled slightly, and Margaret could see the conflict there, the guilt he had been carrying. Finally, she looked at Linda. Linda, you've built a beautiful life for yourself and David. You've raised wonderful children and created a home full of love. That matters more than any business success. Linda said nothing, but her rigid posture had softened slightly. Margaret handed the microphone back to Robert. The reception gradually returned to normal, though with a different energy than before. Conversations resumed, but they were more subdued, more thoughtful. Several old business associates approached Margaret to shake her hand and share memories she had thought were forgotten. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself surrounded by people she hadn't spoken to in years. The isolation that had defined her night was replaced by recognition, by respect, by the simple human connection she had missed so desperately. But the moment that mattered most came when David finally approached her, his face raw with emotion. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret reached for his hand. David, we don't have to. Yes, we do. I let Linda rewrite everything. I let her treat you like you didn't matter. I was weak and I'm ashamed of myself. Margaret squeezed his hand. You're not weak. You're human. We all make mistakes. How can you forgive me? Because you're my son. Because I love you. Because that's what families do. As the reception finally came to an end, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how others saw her but in how she saw herself. For the first time in years she felt like Margaret Chun again. Not just David's mother or Emma's grandmother, but a woman with her own story worth telling. The cleanup at the venue was winding down as Margaret gathered her small purse and prepared to leave. The evening air had grown crisp, and most of the guests had already departed, leaving behind empty champagne glasses and the lingering scent of flowers. Emma found her near the garden entrance, still radiant despite the long day. "Grandma, wait," Emma called, hurrying over in her wedding dress, now slightly wrinkled from hours of celebration. "I need to talk to you." Margaret paused, studying her granddaughter's face. There was something different in Emma's expression, a determination that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emma glanced around to make sure they were alone, then took Margaret's hands. "I've been thinking about what happened tonight. About what Robert said about how Mom and Dad have been treating you. It's not okay, and it's not going to continue. Emma, you don't need to worry about family politics on your wedding day." "Yes, I do. Because family is exactly what this is about." Emma's voice grew stronger. "You know what I remember from when I was little? You teaching me to read financial statements when I was 8 years old. You showing me how to negotiate with the ice cream truck driver to get a better deal. You telling me stories about building your company from nothing." Margaret smiled at the memories. "You were always interested in business even as a child. Because you made it interesting. You made me believe I could do anything." Emma's eyes filled with tears again. "And then somewhere along the way, everyone started acting like none of that mattered. Like you had just been sitting around all these years doing nothing important." Before Margaret could respond, David appeared beside them. His face was still etched with the shame and regret that had been visible since Robert's speech. "Mom, could we talk? Privately?" Emma squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'll give you two some space. But Grandma, this conversation isn't over. There are things that need to change." After Emma walked away, David and Margaret stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. The sounds of the cleanup crew working inside the venue provided a distant backdrop to their conversation. "I don't know how to begin," David said finally. "The beginning is usually a good place," Margaret replied gently. David ran his hands through his hair, messing up the perfect styling from earlier in the evening. "I think it started slowly. Linda would make little comments about how the business world had changed, how your methods were old-fashioned. First I defended you. But then it became easier to just agree with her." "Yeah." David's voice was barely audible. "And once I started agreeing, it became easier to let her tell the story her way. To let people think I had built everything myself. I told myself it didn't really matter, that you didn't care about credit anyway." Margaret felt the familiar ache in her chest, but it was softer now, tempered by understanding. "I did care, David. More than I let on. I know. God, I know that now. When Robert was talking tonight, when I saw your face." David's voice broke slightly. "I realized what I'd done. I didn't just let Linda erase your contributions to the company. I let her erase you from our family." They walked slowly toward the parking area, their footsteps echoing on the stone pathway. Margaret could see Linda in the distance, supervising the loading of wedding gifts into their car. Her daughter-in-law's movements were sharp, efficient, but there was something defeated in her posture. "Linda isn't a bad person," Margaret said. "She just wanted her own story, her own importance. That doesn't excuse what we did to you." "No, it doesn't. But understanding it might help us figure out how to move forward." David stopped walking and turned to face her. "Is that possible? Moving forward? After everything?" Margaret considered the question. A year ago, even a week ago, she might have said yes immediately, might have been so grateful for any acknowledgement that she would have accepted whatever scraps of relationship they offered. But tonight had changed something in her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'd like to try, but things can't go back to the way they were. I won't make myself small anymore to make other people comfortable. I wouldn't want you to. I want." David struggled with the words. "I want my mother back. The real one. The one who built a company and raised me to believe I could do anything. Not the quiet woman who sits in the back and pretends she doesn't matter." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. That woman is still here. She just forgot how to speak up for herself. They reached Margaret's car, a modest sedan that looked plain next to the luxury vehicles surrounding it. David helped her with her door, a small gesture that reminded her of when he was young and still eager to please her. "Mom, would you consider coming to dinner next Sunday? Just family. I want to talk to Linda, to make sure she understands that things need to change. Margaret paused with her hand on the car door. What if she doesn't want things to change? Then she'll have to learn to want it. Because I'm not losing you again. As Margaret drove home through the quiet streets, she found herself thinking about Robert's unexpected appearance. She pulled out her phone at a red light and sent him a text. Thank you for tonight. I didn't know I needed someone to speak up for me until you did. His response came quickly. You would have done the same for me. That's what real partnerships are about. Margaret's house felt different when she walked through the front door. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed peaceful, full of possibility rather than emptiness. She made herself a cup of tea and sat on her back porch, looking out at her herb garden in the moonlight. Her phone rang and she was surprised to see Emma's name on the screen. Hi, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be with your new husband? Emma's laugh came through the phone. He's packing for our honeymoon. I wanted to call before we left tomorrow. Grandma, I need to ask you something. Of course. Would you consider coming back to the company? Not in David's role, but in your own capacity? As a consultant or an advisor, or whatever title you want. Margaret set down her teacup. Emma, that's very sweet, but I'm serious. Marcus and I have been talking about starting our own consulting firm, and we want to learn from the best. From someone who actually built something lasting. What does your father think about this? I haven't asked him yet. I'm asking you first. This would be our decision, not his. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement, the first she'd experienced about work in years. I'd need to think about it. Think about it. But Grandma? Don't think about what other people want. Think about what you want. What would make you happy? After they hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet of her porch for a long time. What did she want? For so many years she had defined herself by what others needed from her. She had been the devoted mother, the understanding former wife, the accommodating grandmother. But who was she when she stopped trying to make everyone else comfortable? The next morning, Margaret woke with an unusual sense of energy. She made her coffee and sat down with a notebook, something she hadn't done in years. At the top of the page she wrote, "What I want." The list started slowly, tentatively. To be acknowledged for my contributions. To have meaningful work again. To be included in family decisions that affect me. To stop apologizing for taking up space. As she wrote, the list grew longer, bolder. To mentor young entrepreneurs. To travel to places I've always wanted to see. To write about my experiences building a business. To be proud of who I am, not just what I've sacrificed. Margaret stared at the list for a long time. Some items scared her. They required her to step back into a world she had retreated from, to make herself visible again. Others excited her in ways she had forgotten were possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Linda and I talked last night. She wants to apologize to you properly. Would you be willing to meet for lunch this week? Margaret typed back. Yes, but not at home. Somewhere public, neutral. Another text, this one from Emma. Marcus and I are serious about the consulting firm. When you're ready to talk, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And finally, one from Robert. I'm in town for a few more days. Would you like to get coffee and catch up properly? I have some ideas you might find interesting. Margaret looked at her phone, then at her list, then out at her garden where the morning sun was just beginning to touch the leaves. For the first time in years she had choices to make. Real choices about her future. Not just reactions to other people's decisions. She thought about the woman she had been 20 years ago, confident, decisive, unafraid to take risks. That woman was still there, just buried under years of trying to be what everyone else needed her to be. Margaret picked up her pen and added one more item to her list. To remember that my story isn't over yet. That afternoon she called a real estate agent. Not to sell her house but to look at office spaces. Small ones, suitable for a consulting firm run by a grandmother and her ambitious granddaughter. As she drove to the first showing, Margaret caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror and was surprised to see that she was smiling. The last few years had taught her an important lesson. Love without self-respect becomes martyrdom. She had loved her family so much that she had nearly disappeared entirely. But tonight had shown her that true love, the kind Emma offered, the kind David was beginning to remember, didn't require her to be small. Margaret Chen had built something once before from nothing. As she pulled into the parking lot of a small office building with a "For Lease" sign in the window, she realized she was ready to build something again. This time, she wouldn't forget to include herself in the story. The future stretched ahead of her, uncertain but full of potential. And for the first time in years, Margaret was excited to see what would happen next.